Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Delray Beach Chamber of Commerce's weekly webinar. It's been a little while since we last saw you, but we're super excited today for our presentation. It's going to be presented by the managing partner, Shelby Fabian from Vector Advisory. And the topic today is M&A insights and best practices for integration. So we're super excited to welcome him on. During this webinar, if you'd like, you can go ahead and type any questions you have down in the bottom chat. We will make sure to get towards those at the end where we do have a live Q&A. These webinars can always be found afterwards on the Delray Beach website, on Facebook, and on YouTube. So you can rewatch this and share it at any time if you'd like. So at this time, we're going to welcome Shelby onto the screen.
Hello, how's it going?
Good.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and turn this over to you, and we're excited for the presentation.
Thank you, and thanks for everybody that is able to join this either live or at a recorded time later. I will get my screen shared now. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to speak with this group today about M&A insights and best practices for integration. I think, yeah, this comes at a very appropriate time right now. And I'll talk about this in a little bit later. But the amount of activity in this space in terms of companies growing through acquisition is really at an all-time high. And so I think more and more companies are looking at mergers and acquisitions as a path for growth. And, you know, inevitably, when you go through that process, there's a lot of focus on the actual closing. But, you know, you really don't want to underestimate what it means to actually effectively integrate these businesses so that ultimately you're able to achieve the business outcomes that were expected, you know, back when the target was even identified. So with that, you know, just kind of start with an introduction on myself. My name is Shelby Fabian. I'm the founder of Vector Advisory. Vector is a little over a year old as a firm. My background and that of my team is generally Big Four backgrounds, so very large firm backgrounds, as well as folks from global industry leaders, and really kind of bringing, I think, a balanced mix of client service delivery through big firms, as well as experience in actually delivering in leadership roles within industry. So I think we're also able to bring a very practical approach to delivery and working with companies. We generally are working with companies from between 10 million in revenue up all the way up to about 500 million in revenue, pretty broad there. But, you know, I'd say largely I created the firm to focus on the lower middle market, which is that of maybe less than 200 million. And really provide services across a number of fronts, which I'll share on the next screen. Again, my background, Big Four, I am a CPA. I've also got some operational background, having led in a variety of leadership roles in industry, everything from operational segment CFO to shared services to chief audit executive. And by having those types of experiences, it's lend itself very well to doing merger and acquisition support because I'm able to work very closely with companies across all of the different functional areas, having had significant exposure to them. So that kind of allows me to not need to be delivering with a very large team. And again, that works out really well with smaller companies. In terms of our service offerings, we offer finance and accounting advisory, portfolio company onboarding. So we work with a lot of private equity firms in terms of bringing new acquisitions into their portfolio and then just kind of standardizing the types of reporting that they're going to be getting from those businesses such that they're able to more consistently evaluate the performance of those investments and assets. We also are providing a great deal of merger and acquisition integration support. And I would say that since I founded my business just over a year ago, the majority of the work that we've done has been helping private equity and portfolio companies with merger and acquisition integration support services. And again, that's what we're here to talk about today. We also provide internal audit and risk management services and But with that, again, today we're going to be focusing on merger and acquisition integration. The objectives today are really to kind of walk you through an overview of M&A. Perhaps there's a couple of folks in the call that really haven't considered that as a path for growth. And we'll talk about why companies do that. We'll talk about some of the challenges of actually getting M&A right. And then ultimately share with you some best practices that have worked out very well for me and for my clients. And hopefully there's going to be some opportunities that folks on this call can be able to leverage to the extent that they're looking at making acquisitions in the near term. So why do companies go down the path of mergers and acquisitions? It's generally a very quick path to innovation, to new products. It can certainly also be a way to be able to access hard to access markets and geographies. And it's just it can be an accelerator for an organization, and also just kind of help in terms of just kind of market expansion and creating kind of a differentiator in terms of size, synergy, and scale. It's also, and right now, many companies that are looking to hire, they can understand this. It can be a great way to acquire talent. So instead of having to go out there and recruit, interview, and onboard, you could actually just buy a company that actually already has that trained talent, which could be be very, very significant, especially in a time right now where it's really difficult to be able to hire great talent. One thing I wanted to mention, certainly during the pandemic, we saw a significant slowdown in acquisitions and generally just investments during 2020. But ultimately what happened was that we saw that these investors, basically the cash coffers kind of continued to fill. And now what we're seeing in 2021 is basically growth that not only covered that slowdown in 2020, but indeed is continuing to accelerate through the end of this year. Right now, I'm constantly hearing about companies struggling to even find consultants to be able to help them with financial diligence, with legal diligence, and other critical aspects of acquisition target evaluation. And again, it's very, very difficult right now to be able to close on a company, especially in a reasonable time frame. So the M&A challenge, I hear this all of the time from our private equity clients. The standard kind of business thesis here is I'm going to go out, I'm going to find me a good business that already has a really strong management team. And I'm going to support them with strategies and best practices to grow organically, as well as to look at opportunities to expand through acquisition. And some of the key considerations that they're looking at is the customer value proposition, opportunities to really kind of expand and enhance profit. But then ultimately, right, they're always trying to evaluate the resources and the processes that exist within these organizations for creating value for their customers. The reasonable and standard assumption that companies make is that if I combine two companies with good management, it should be very simple. But what we see in survey after survey is that the failure rate for mergers and acquisitions in terms of actually achieving the returns that they anticipated is actually over 50%. There's actually some studies that say it's as high as 80% of failure. And so, what we see is that there's a significant opportunity for the companies that can very quickly and effectively integrate businesses so that they can then achieve these greater returns. There's also a recent study by Deloitte that indicated that, how do I go about, how do I actually enhance my ability to be able to integrate more successfully? Well, integration execution is cited as the #1 contributor to M&A success. And again, that's kind of what we're talking about today, and that's what we work with companies on day in and day out. So some of the challenges, some of the things that contribute to that failure rate: poor fit, misunderstanding of business model, I think, is also something that can really be a detriment. Lack of management alignment, I'll speak a lot about that. I think that's one of the most critical aspects. And then ultimately culture. And surprisingly, this is kind of one of the primary reasons for M&A failure is often cited as cultural differences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So what drives success? So how do we make sure that 1+1 is actually going to get us a return of greater than 2? Number one, you really need to be effective during the due diligence cycle. And we'll talk in a moment about the fact that your integration planning really should start during the due diligence phase. It really should not be starting post-closing, which I think a number of companies routinely make as a mistake. They kind of focus on financial analysis. They focus on getting a deal closed, and then once it's closed, then it's okay. Well, now let's try to figure out how we bring these organizations together, and that kind of planning really needs to be happening up front. Executive support and prioritization. Inevitably, we see, especially with the smaller companies, there's normally a substantial number of projects with limited resources. So we've got resources that are spread very, very thin. And if it's not clear that this is the priority of the company, oftentimes some of the process integration, some of the cross-selling, some of the cost savings and scaling opportunities are just simply not achieved because it was not perceived as a significant priority for the organization. Strong project management's a very clear requirement, and I think it's one that's often undervalued by leveraging kind of a third party, is just really kind of making sure that we've got very clearly articulated project plans for how we get from, again, post-close to, let's say, 90 days out. How do we actually get these organizations operating as one? So this is a framework for combination success, and this is really the general framework that I use in working with companies to bring mergers together successfully. Really starts with at the top, right? Vision alignment, making sure that the leadership within the company understands the reasons behind an acquisition, understands where the value is going to come as a result of that acquisition. And ultimately, you want your people to understand how this is actually going to affect them. Because inevitably your teams will be asked to be working substantial additional time and putting additional effort into this integration work above and beyond their standard 40+ hour work week. Integrated planning, again, very, very critical. We need to make sure that the entire organization maintains visibility to the integration effort, and that everyone kind of understands where system changes are taking place and how people will be trained. And again, how these different changes are going to ultimately affect them and their workflow, and ultimately how they are impacting, how they're interacting with their customers and their suppliers. So, we spend a lot of time in making sure that not only are we working effectively within each functional area of an organization to plan out what that integration means and how we actually execute to that plan, but also making sure that we have opportunities to align all across all the different functions. So cross-functionally, it's important for folks to kind of understand when, let's say, timekeeping systems are going to be changing, or how we're going to be implementing, maybe it's a pricing change, to take advantage of the better practices from two companies. So again, just keeping the company organized and giving them visibility into what this integration means across all of the functions is also very, very critical. Leadership, you can't understate what leadership means throughout this. Post-closing, one of the most significant decisions that needs to be made is exactly who's going to be leading in each functional area. Who on those individual teams are going to be supporting integration on a day-to-day basis, and then ultimately that those folks are holding themselves and their teams accountable for the successful integration of these businesses. And then ultimately the governance and execution. And this goes everything from the tools and the templates that then guide an integration to how we measure progress towards the completion of that integration, as well as how we actually measure, what success looks like. So these are all the different areas that our firm kind of works with companies and helping to kind of confirm and create alignment and awareness across the organization, and then systematically facilitate the integration planning and support the execution and the measurement of progress against that, such that This is not something that's happening on an ad hoc basis. This is not dependent on the knowledge and memory of individuals of what needs to be done when, but that we have very strong project management discipline. We are, basically holding ourselves accountable to meeting commitments, and this can be extremely critical in the case where we have cross-functional dependencies. So sometimes we're making significant technology platform changes that could affect not only operations, but also sales and finance. And so keeping all of these teams kind of aligned and coordinated is critical, because again, if one function falls behind, it could have a significant negative impact to multiple functions within the organization. So some of the other things that we'll kind of work with companies and help with is actually bringing templates and accelerators, as we call them, to the table, so that kind of we're coming with the integration in a box, if you will, so that we can be able to stand up an integration management office very, very quickly. We've got the tools that are then going to facilitate consistent planning. We've got checklists of tasks that need to be considered in terms of integration across each of the different functional areas, and just presentation materials to help kind of facilitate and articulate the value of these combinations to the employees. We also, work very closely with companies in terms of developing and executing communication plans, because, again, so much of these is about really kind of creating the awareness about what is happening, and kind of constantly reinforcing that message as to the why these acquisitions were done or these mergers were completed. And again, how is this deal, how is this transaction going to ultimately help accelerate the growth of each individual company and all of its employees, such that you can create the support that will ultimately be critical to a successful integration. We provide those accelerators in terms of kind of pre-close. And again, I mentioned there's a lot of work that really needs to be done during the due diligence and prior to close, so that on the closing date, you're running. And I think that's one of the mistakes that I see with a lot of companies, is that, in an effort to try to keep close to the vest, the fact that certain transactions are being considered by a company, a lot of times it's not opened up to a broader number of group to even start thinking about what an integrated state looks like for the organization until post-closing. And then at that point, it just kind of, the entire team kind of feels like everybody's trying to play catch up, which can be very frustrating. We also then kind of focus on a typical integration cycle is kind of day 1 through day 90. What you'd like to be able to do, certainly with less complicated integrations, is really set that as the target that, within 3 months, let's integrate these processes. Let's start operating as one company. Let's make sure it's very clear, the organizational structure, the accountability for transactions, the way that technologies will be used. You want to establish all of those things as soon as possible, so that you're not allowing these considerations and decisions to linger, which again can create a great deal of frustration and project fatigue on the part of your entire team. For projects that do have a much longer tail, we also provide tools to support kind of the ongoing measurement of the progress of these integration plans. And again, just as a way to be able to kind of make sure that everybody remains focused on executing these items until they're actually complete. I think all too often projects get very, very close to completion, and the formalized project management structures start to disintegrate, and then all of a sudden you look up and we thought we were 5 yards from the touchdown, and all of a sudden we look back at and we've fumbled. And that's what we want to prevent by establishing the project management rigor and discipline through this process, so that basically we're going to be keeping a spotlight on these items until they're closed out, and then we're going to celebrate the successes throughout. So, I've talked a lot about mergers and acquisitions, and it's definitely different. They definitely have their own aspects that need to be considered separately. Typically with a merger, a lot of times you may have a merger of equals where your objective through the integration is to create a best in breed. So you want to really understand the operating models from both organizations in detail so that you can be able to make an informed decision on what that future state process is going to look like. And as you can imagine, that can add a significant amount of time to the project timeline because of that additional investment up front, so that these functional areas can really consider all the pros and the cons of each process. Normally, it is not a decision that that's really simple to make. You generally have a lot of pros and cons of each approach, and so you just want to try to get as much information as you can so that you can make the best decision. Also, from an acquisition perspective, normally, it's kind of an assumption that the acquiring company will their processes will be retained, and so it's more of a tuck-in or a fold-in, as it's often referred to, integration, where literally just the acquired business is just kind of folded in or merged into the existing processes. Those typically are a lot quicker and more simple to execute on. So this is just really provided as a reference point. As I mentioned, integration planning really needs to start, kind of pre-closing. But typically as of deal closing, there's a lot of communication that is immediately sent out to team members, to potentially clients, to suppliers. So you really want to be able to be in position to execute a communication plan really quickly after deal close. The integration planning starts almost immediately. And so it's really critical to, demonstrate that this is a priority for the organization, and to, as quickly as possible, nail down what the integrated state looks like. What are the key work streams that need to be executed, making sure that the accountability is identified for each of those different work streams and all the various tasks. And then again, facilitate the cross-functional alignment. And so when I talk about an integration summit, some processes wouldn't necessarily require everybody kind of taking, let's say, an afternoon or a day away from the office to be able to really focus on integration. Some cases, maybe it's just a couple of 2-hour meetings that are focused functionally. But I think ultimately each project kind of has to be evaluated separately in terms of the complexity and the need for certain aspects of the actual integration planning that are described here. The walk the wall workshop is great if you anticipate a significant amount of cross-functional dependency, just to kind of make sure that as we kind of do a transaction walkthrough or a transaction process flow, we can be able to have all the appropriate team members listening and seeing how that actually goes through and might be affecting multiple functions. Again, typically seen when there's going to be a significant technology platform change as a result of a merger or an acquisition. And then ultimately, once we have nailed down our integration plans, then it goes on to executing, providing the right level of governance and support to just maintain focus and measure progress throughout, again, holding teams accountable, and then ultimately providing the additional support that teams might need or identify that they need throughout the execution of that integration. So an approach to managing mergers and acquisitions that's presented here. Again, as I mentioned, really starting in due diligence, then we have kind of a pre-close focus. Then I've got kind of this playbook that I use that's kind of typically, let's kind of create our detailed integration plans over a 5 to 6 week period, and then we go straight into sustaining the execution. Now, from a due diligence perspective, I've listed a number of key questions, I think, for consideration. So, if you are looking at a target, right, these are some of the things that you might want to go through, right? So, how are we going to articulate what this means to our customers? Are we actually going to be bringing them expanded service offerings? Are they going to see this? Is there potential that they could see this in a negative light, that we could potentially lose existing work as a result of this acquisition or merger? We want to be thinking through how we're going to be, communicating this to our customers. We could certainly also have strategic suppliers that will need to be thinking through how we articulate these changes to them. I think one of the things that I always like to ask companies is when you start to think about a merger or an acquisition is to say, what from, each of these companies do we want to make certain does not go away through, kind of this integration process. Maybe it's a best practice around recruiting. Maybe it's how we treat our people. Maybe it's certain better practices that have worked extremely well in terms of driving revenue and growth. But it's something that's really important to draw out, because sometimes just in the shuffle of operating model assessment and evaluation and developing a target operating model, sometimes we can forget about those things. So just kind of think about some of these things that really need to be part of our our guideline, if you will, or guardrail for this integration planning, to say, hey, you know what, this is off limits. We want to make sure that this doesn't change. Again, start thinking about the cultures. I've seen some really good best practices here of demonstrating the importance of this up front, by having workshops to go through and compare mission statements and vision statements, and talk about some of the day-to-day factors that really kind of influence the way people describe the culture, and why employee satisfaction is what it is within these different companies. So I think making sure that has proper visibility, and has the appropriate level of attention throughout, I think is really critical. Again, culture being cited as one of the primary reasons for merger success or failure. So pre-close planning, again, this is where I think it's really critical, where the leadership, and sometimes that's a limited group, maybe that's just the CFO and the president, but really kind of thinking and jotting down some points specific to the integration strategy, specific to the vision. Again, really making sure that it's crystal clear to the owner as to why this acquisition target has been identified, or this merger is looking like it's going to move forward. If the leadership can't articulate that, it's going to be very difficult to be able to articulate that to the different functional leaders and other leadership within the organization. As I mentioned, you're going to want to initiate the communication plan so that you've got something in place ready to be executed on day one. That includes things like employee FAQs. That includes things like customer communication, emails, maybe it's specific calls for strategic customers, but you really want to kind of nail down the communication plan pre-closing, so that on the day of the announcement, that's handy, and you're ready to be able to execute that. Other things for consideration. Are we going to actually do a press release? Is it important? For some companies that are more of a conglomerate of brands, doing a press release is not all that important. But hey, when are we updating our websites so that each company's website refers to the other company? Or again, determining whether that's even necessary. Defining all the different tools and the infrastructure that's going to support the integration, I think, is also helpful. In some organizations, everybody's using Google Drive, some are using SharePoint, OneDrive. Just starting to kind of think about the different ways that we're going to be using online file collaboration, and how we're ultimately going to manage the integration in terms of tools. In some organizations, Excel is adequate to facilitate the planning. But then in other organizations, it's a little bit more, again, complicated. They may think of different tools out there like Smartsheets or Asana, and Monday.com is actually another website that has project planning tools. And so having some of these items just kind of nailed down for the post-closing is really critical. What you'd like to be able to be in position for is that the day of the announcement, you're literally bringing your functional leaders together, and the team leads, the folks that are going to have the active involvement for integration execution. You want to be able to bring those together as soon after the closing as possible, and be able to demonstrate that this is going to be our approach. This is going to be our path to successful integration. That will immediately instill a high degree of confidence in the teams. And it will also demonstrate clearly that this is a priority for the organization, and that we've got a game plan for success. I've listed out a number of other items that might be considered pre-closing, including legal entity structures for tax efficient strategy planning, thinking about synergies that might be revenue synergies for cross-selling, that may also be cost or scale synergies that will actually help the organization through growth without potentially needing to add headcount. There may be some redundancies that are identified as a result of an acquisition or a merger that you would want to be really planning to achieve, and then ultimately making sure that we establish project plans that will ensure their success. On this slide, I actually present a tool that is available on my company's website. So if you go to vector-advisory.com, you will see a link to be able to download our M&A integration planning tool. And this is a very simple tool that probably takes less than, I would say, 30 minutes for somebody to really consider. And really, it kind of helps to just answer a couple of questions. Number one, if you think about kind of the 5 major areas of an integration, you've got, finance and administration, you have operations, you have sales, you have payroll, and then you have technology. So across each of those major pillars of integration of a company, within each of those areas, I've highlighted some of the more standard considerations in terms of integration. And so what this tool allows you to do is just to think through those for just a moment. It allows you to, again, kind of step back a little bit from kind of the deal making, the deal closing focus, to just kind of think about it from a process standpoint and say, hey, is this relevant to the integration? Yes or no? Again, very simple and binary. And then as I think about that, if it is relevant, would I think that this is going to be a very low or a moderate lift, or do I think this is actually going to be a very high level of effort that would be required for integration in this area? Maybe it's very complicated. Maybe it's just going to require a great deal of time. So to be able to kind of think about that is critical. You can be able to take notes within this tool and have that available so that when you are ready to communicate the transaction a little bit more broadly, you have readily accessible information that kind of helps provide, again, the guardrails for the integration. Kind of beyond the level of effort, we also say, hey, what do we have the skill and the capacity internal to be able to be successful in this area? And I think that those are the kind of 3 major considerations. Again, the relevancy, the level of effort required, and the skill and capacity internally to be able to support it. I think those are critical because, ultimately, if something is very complicated and it's going to be very time sensitive, and we don't have the skill and capacity internally, we might want to think about bringing in an external party. Maybe it's a subject matter expert in the area of sales to be able to realign incentive plans. Maybe it's somebody to lead the integration management office, just somebody to be able to kind of provide oversight and direction to this entire process. But that's really what this tool is intended to do. And I hope that if you're considering a transaction, you can download that, and then I hope that it'll be beneficial. So, I'll kind of walk through the game plan or the playbook that we've established for the integration. Starts with week 1 planning. Again, thinking about employee communications, customer communications. As I mentioned, we want to be able to do a PMO kickoff. We want to be able to kind of communicate to our team that will then drive the integration, that this is what our process is going to be. Here's who is on the team. Again, in a lot of cases, that's introducing team members from the 2 separate companies for the first time. We are, connecting the sponsors. And when I say sponsor, I would say functional leaders across the company. And then we start facilitating working sessions with these functional leaders to start thinking through the various work streams and tasks that will need to be considered and effectively executed in order for us to be able to have a successful integration. Then week 2, to the extent that an integration summit would be required, or again, this could be on a much smaller scale. This could just be, kind of meetings that then occur over the next week to 2 weeks of really kind of saying, hey, what are our priorities? How are we going to define integration success within this functional area? What are some of the issues or risks that we need to think about? How would we mitigate them? And then ultimately, what are going to be kind of the key milestones that the team wants to be able to commit to in terms of its integration plan? Week 3, week 4, and week 5 really is just kind of further vetting and expansion of the integration plans, and then ultimately getting our teams in position to be able to effectively articulate again, what does integrated state look like? How are we going to get there? And how will we measure what success looks like? And that's really going to be the focus in this area. And then that's going to ultimately bring us to a potential walk the wall. Again, if we have a significant amount of cross-functional dependencies, if we have significant technology platform changes that are happening as a result of this transaction, that might be a reason that might actually necessitate doing a walk the wall. I think a lot of times, especially what I see in kind of smaller acquisitions, and I would say, companies in maybe a $50 million range buying a company in the $20 or $30 million range, a lot of times something like this is not necessary, but again, just needs to be considered. And then as you think about sustained execution, again, this is kind of going from, let's say, day like 60 and beyond, really. It's making sure that everybody has that standard recurring meeting on their calendar that reminds them that, hey, I've got to be able to present the progress that I've made over the last week. I need to be able to present that I hit all the due dates that I had in my project plan for this last week, or am I constantly shifting dates to the right as a result of other competing priorities? Or perhaps those are some, challenges or issues that I'm running into, with other functional areas. That's why it says here cross-functional as required. A lot of times you want to, I think each company really should kind of identify the primary integration leader. That might be a chief of staff, that might be a CFO, maybe any number of other positions within the organization, but it should be very clear within the organization who is running and responsible for the integration effort. It should also be very clear that when people do not meet their commitments, that matters. We've got to be able to hold all of the team members accountable. And ultimately, the teams need to be responsible for keeping their integration plans realistic, and constantly being updated in terms of any sort of changes or shifts in terms of timelines. Normally, you would have, most companies end up having weekly to bi-weekly functional meetings. Normally, you're looking at a monthly steering committee meeting, potentially a monthly cross-functional meeting, again, if that's warranted. And then oftentimes there's quarterly board reporting. So these are just some different considerations as you think about kind of the ongoing execution and management of the process to help ensure that all the different integration plans and tasks that are identified are ultimately performed. So I wanted to spend a little time too, again, I talked a little bit about, in some cases like a walk the wall event, something that would require, this greater complexity, more system changes, potentially more cross-functional issues. Really, when you think about an acquisition or a merger, they can really, run the gamut. It could be a very, very small acquisition where you're literally just buying customers. It could be, again, extremely difficult, very complicated, again, substantial technology platform changes. So I just wanted to kind of, just share this slide that, again, hopefully is a reference point. A lot of times you'll hear the term tuck in. This is generally, again, the acquirer is just going to kind of absorb the requirements of the acquired company. And it's a little bit more straightforward. These things are very low complexity. And I think a lot of times when you have an organization that decides that it's going to grow down this path, they might have very good and repeatable processes. And it may in fact be worthwhile for them to invest in resources, a corporate development type function or process to manage ongoing tuck-ins if there's going to be a number of those over a period of time. Then you've got strategic acquisitions. These are medium. Again, in a lot of cases, you're gaining new access to different geographies, potentially expanding service sets. A lot of times I would say that this is more of a medium complexity because, again, this could really kind of change the way that we're going to market. It can really impact how we need to incentivize our sales teams to ultimately get the benefit of this combined organization. And ultimately, we're talking about changes that can kind of impact the way that our customers perceive us. And so, again, I think that brings in a different level of complexity and therefore may require some additional resource capacity and support to be able to help ensure that it's successful. The merger is, I think, the most complicated. Again, there's generally a high degree of dependencies. There's generally some significant technology changes that are having to take place, and it really requires substantial investment in terms of process understanding, documentation, and rigor to be able to help ensure that these processes are evaluated efficiently, effectively, and in a way that helps the entire organization come to the exact same decision, so that you're constantly kind of creating ongoing support for the continued progression of the integration effort. I'm often asked, what are some of the lessons learned from integration? And these are the types of things that I hear kind of near the end. Hey, I misunderstood the amount of testing that was going to be required. Hey, we were probably a little aggressive on our timeline, based on our resource capacity. I think you really want to be able to be realistic there. Communication, throughout. I think that goes again at the leadership level, making sure that you're constantly reinforcing the investment thesis, the reasoning behind these transactions, and you want to make sure that there's a path to be able to get that communication all the way down within the organization. That we're not just hitting the highest levels within the organization, but we're helping all of our employees feel like this is a good thing for them, and then gaining their support through that process. Again, I've got a number of other items here that I think are there for more reference, but wanted to make sure that I leave plenty of time for some questions here at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause and see if there is any questions at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, I'm just going to pull the screen up. All right. Thank you so much, Selby. We really appreciate it. That was quite a bit of information. And I wonder how many people are unaware that that information actually exists. So thank you so much to our viewers that joined us through Facebook. If you have any questions, I see you guys there. So please feel free to type them down below in the chat box, and we'll make sure to get to those for you. But in the meantime, let's dive right in. So I kind of want to circle back a little bit to that integration tool that can be found at www.vectoradvisory.com. Is that a free tool for people to use?
Yeah. It is. Thank you for asking that. We did make that complimentary on our website. Mm-hmm. Again, it's really intended, I think, as a nice little kind of reference point for organizations, because when you think about the organization, it can be a little overwhelming when you start to think about all these different processes. And so what I wanted to do is just have, in a simple 25-point questionnaire, what are kind of the major considerations for the integration. Again, keep it fairly binary for high-level presidents and CEOs that may be using that tool to be able to say, again, is this relevant to me? Do I have the resources internally to help ensure I can successfully integrate? And again, what's the level of effort that we think is required? Because ultimately, I think organizations often have challenges when they don't have enough support resources internally to allow these things to move forward. And I think all too often, people start missing due dates. They start, everything starts sliding to the right. They start thinking that maybe this isn't the priority for the organization. And there can be a lot of frustration. So you really want to try to, throughout this entire process, it's about continuing to motivate the team members. And that can just be demotivating when basically the team member says, there's just no way that I've got the resource and capacity to be able to make this success.
Right. No, absolutely. That is wonderful that it is free. A lot of times companies, they charge for things like that. So guys, take advantage of that if it is something that you think that you can utilize. And based on this presentation, I think a lot of companies out there can utilize it. So what are some of the challenges companies have managing the integration themselves?
I think the biggest thing is just that lack of bandwidth. I think especially for the lower middle market, a lot of times you've got multiple people wearing multiple hats within the organization. Everybody's working more than 40 hours a week just on their day job. And then post acquisition, I think that there's just an underestimated level of effort around how you're actually going to, again, integrate this new group of people, evaluate current processes and vendors and suppliers and customers, and what does this mean to each. There's just so many different process tracks and things to do that I think it's often misunderstood the level of project management required. And I think all too often when companies try to do it internally, they're just kind of sharing that responsibility across everyone. And what happens is everybody plans at different levels. Somebody will have a project plan that has 4 major objectives. Somebody else has got 250 detailed tasks that they're going to be tracking. Everybody's just doing it in inconsistent ways, and that can ultimately result in an inconsistent outcome.
Right. And I'm sure that can become overwhelming rather quickly.
Oh, absolutely. I think, for a lot of the companies that I'm working with in that space, they've never done an acquisition before. So it's a little bit of deer in the headlights from, the organization. Like, what does this mean? How can I do this? And again, once you start scheduling these meetings that often have six or more people in there so that you can kind of understand a process from beginning to end, you're documenting those meeting notes, you're following up on all the action items. It's just, there's a lot of things that go into it that I think people don't fully understand, I think, the first time that they go through it. And so, I'm hoping that maybe with the tool and maybe some references like this out there, it can kind of create a little bit of greater awareness, because this really should be an exciting time for organizations. It really is a path for accelerated growth and excitement. But you want to be able to do it right so that, 6 months later, everybody's not, kind of looking around going, what exactly did we do? And what changed? And everybody's just kind of doing their own thing. And we're using duct tape and baling wire to produce, financial statements and
Who are we?
yeah,
Who am I? Where are we?
exactly.
I'm just imagining like a little office running around all crazy with like their hats falling off and stuff. Um,
Exactly. It's not too far off.
so I don't. This might be relevant to the business or not, or specified to a specific business or not. But what do you find the biggest challenge for companies integrating be? Like, what do you find the biggest challenge to be?
I think trying to find that right level of pace for the integration, I think, is often a big challenge. Inevitably, you'll have one organization that's wanting to move very, very quickly, and another organization that's again, just culturally, they're they want to move much slower. So I think that pace and culture, I think, is kind of a common challenge. I would say one of the most difficult things, though, is anytime there is a significant technology platform change. Again, a lot of times this is affecting the way that you produce a quote to customers. This is affecting how you're accounting for a transaction, how you're collecting fee. When you start changing those operating platforms, a lot of times you're really changing your entire business model. So there's a very, very high degree of risk there that really has to be effectively managed and tested throughout, coordinated across multiple departments. Yeah, I would say that would probably be my number 2.
Okay. And does the pace typically remain the same throughout the process, or is it something that evolves as the process is moving along?
I mean, I think so much of it is really kind of established by the leadership. I mean, I think the CEO really needs to have a good understanding of what he sees as the vision of the integrated state. And then he should kind of set that bar for the team in terms of the aggressive approach or lack of aggressive timeline. But then again, it's got to be also very, very clear what's in it for the team to make this a success. It's got to be very clear that this is one of the most significant priorities for the organization. And it's also got to be very clear that they're going to be held accountable for the results. And I think that's where it's really critical for the organization to identify. I call it kind of the hammer
Right.
of what's going to happen if people keep missing their due dates, because inevitably you will miss due dates. I think that it's not all that different from a forecast. It's really good until the ink dries,
Right.
but you want to be able to kind of say, hey, number one, let's be realistic.
Right.
And number 2, I want to be able to see that we're putting really solid effort into making this happen. Again, this is not something that people have time for in kind of their day to schedule. So this is above and beyond work. Everybody should know that it is, and that's the expectation that really needs to be kind of laid out front.
Wonderful. Okay. And then I guess my last question would be, what advice would you give to someone considering buying a company?
Yeah. So, I think that you really want to start to think about what does that integration look like? Again, you want to be able to effectively articulate the why behind this. And if that's a little wishy-washy for yourself as the CEO, the founder, somebody that's looking at it, if you can't really clearly understand that, then I think that you need to really kind of keep digging within that diligence. You really want to start thinking about, again, how do these two organizations work together a year from now in a way that is, maybe each company was each growing at a 10% clip before. How do we get them each growing at 15% after? Right? That, I think, has to be really nailed down during the diligence. So I would say don't undercut the diligence phase, and don't undercut the integration planning happening within that diligence phase, because again, I think all too often, many times, I think organizations just are really excited about the ability to close on this transaction and arranging for the financing and the investment and all of this. But then the closing happens and the teams are left wondering, wait, which system should we be going to? Are we really open to considering a change here? How is this ultimately going to impact our customers? And I think that these are things that really should be, we should establish guardrails during that diligence phase, so that when you close on this transaction, there's a decent level of guidance to provide to the teams to create the clarity that's going to ultimately translate into effective planning and execution of that integration plan to ultimately achieve that investment thesis.
Great. So not only good advice for buying a company, but I feel like that's kind of good advice for life in a lot of aspects. Handing out words of wisdom over here, guys. All right. I don't see any questions on our Facebook Live, but if any of our viewers do have questions, can they reach you after this webinar, and how can they reach you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping that within this presentation here that I've got the email address, and if it's not, I will make sure to send that to you.
Yeah,
it's not. I'll send a version that actually has the email address attached to it.
Sure, absolutely. And we'll make sure to get that information out there. So guys, I noticed a bunch of you hopped on about halfway through this presentation. If you want to go back and watch this, we will have it available. It's on Facebook as we speak now. And later in the day, it will be available on YouTube and on the website, along with Shelby's information in case you would like to reach out to him. So we thank you for joining us at this week's weekly webinar. We thank you so much, Shelby, for presenting with us. And thank you, Vector Advisory, optimizing business value and then some. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye.